Hi, my name is Carl Pearson. This is a talk prepared for the Parallel and Distributed Scientific and Engineering Computing Workshop at IPDPS 2022. This talk is on machine learning for CUDA and MPI design rules. I'm a postdoc at Sandia National Labs, and this was done with two of my collaborators there, Karen Devine and Arya Javid. The background for this work is that we're interested in supporting and developing fast libraries, or fast math libraries specifically, I guess, for heterogeneous architectures. So some of the kind of fundamental problems in that area are if you have some particular computation you want to do and you have to decide how to map it onto your processing elements, you have to decide how those processing elements are going to communicate. And after you've done all that, or while you're doing all that, there's a high degree of somewhat unpredictable performance interaction just because of the complexity of the heterogeneous systems. So, specifically these days we're typically interested in this sort of CPU plus GPU architectures. And so what this work is about is basically prototyping some tooling that can help discover what design decisions in the library design are the important ones. And so the idea here is that this can help us reduce the developer effort for achieving high performance on these systems, but simultaneously we want to maintain human provenance of the design. And that just basically means that, we want some humans who are in the loop or able to explain why the library is designed or behaves the way it does. And so, for example, the T-Petra package of Trilinos handles sort of distributed linear algebra operations, and we're working on the particular design points for that library and improving its design. So we address two sort of key challenges in this work. One is that there's a large design space of possible library implementations. And we basically express that possible design space as a directed acyclic graph of various more primitive operations. And we use something called Monte-Carlo tree search to identify and explore the particular regions of interest in that design space. And then the second piece is, once you've done some design space exploration, how do you turn that into sort of actionable performance insights for the library design or development team. And so we'll sort of do a combination. This is where the machine learning comes in. We'll use some empirical benchmarking to determine, which implementations are good or bad. We'll translate some features of our implementation into vectors and do decision tree training to extract the design rules. And so the sort of current status of this is that we have a prototype that sort of passes a credible sniff test, and we're working on broader experiments and quantitative evaluation. So our view of the world is that libraries are built on existing low-level primitives. So, those primitives may be provided by a system vendor or another library, but basically if we think of ourselves as being, working on Trilinos, what we're talking about is maybe there are some other Trilinos operations that we're going to rely on, or maybe some CUDA+MPI or CUDA level primitives, and our goal is to coordinate them along with whatever custom code that we have to support our library behavior. Part of the problem is that whenever we have a new supercomputer that comes online, right, their new hardware provides some performance difference. There's new versions of CUDA, new operating system versions, new vendor library versions. This can all have an impact on the performance in a somewhat unpredictable way. Hopefully it improves the performance, but in an unpredictable way for our library code. So the big picture of the prototype implementation is we describe our design space using a directed acyclic graph of operations. And then we have Monte-Carlo tree search that searches, sort of explores the possible order of operations and resource assignments for those operations. And this is implemented in C++, CUDA, and MPI. So this is sort of implemented in the same language as it's common for the application code to be implemented in, because we do some empirical benchmarking of this application. So we need to run the actual library code of interest. Then sort of in the post-processing or analysis side, that's where we'll do this machine learning part. So we'll basically transform the results of our design space search into class labels and feature vectors for each implementation. And then we'll do some decision tree training and turn that into textual design rules for the development team. So just as a concrete example of this entire process, let's consider sort of a classic distributed sparse matrix vector multiplication. So here at the top middle of the screen here, I'm showing the product of the A matrix with the X vector to produce a y vector. And so what we're going to consider is that the A matrix, all three of these operands are distributed sort of row-wise across the ranks. So a common way we want to sort of desire to implement this is that we can split this up into two independent sparse matrix vector multiplications in each rank. So there's sort of a quote-unquote local part, or sort of on-rank part, and a remote part, or an off-rank part. And so the on-rank part is the part of the A matrix that corresponds to the X vector entries that are owned by my rank. So for each rank, that will be a different part of the A matrix. And then there's also an off-rank part, which is the parts of the A matrix that correspond to X vector entries that are owned by another rank. And the key thing here is that the on-rank or local part we can start executing immediately. We don't need to wait to receive X vector entries from any other rank. But the remote part, we have to do some communication first. But these two SPMVs in principle can be done in parallel to produce the final product. So the directed acyclic graph of this specific view or version of the SPMV might look like this. It's sort of broken into three different parts. There's one part where we have to send our local X entries to whatever other ranks need them. And so that's going to be a combination of some CUDA code that will pack up the various parts of our X vector into send buffers. And maybe then we'll post the communications and wait for the communication to complete. The middle part here is basically we need to receive the remote X vector entries, and then we can proceed with the SPMV on that remote data. And then there's this final part, which is just the part of the SPMV that can be done on the local X entries. And so that basically an edge in this graph, if an edge goes from one vertex to another vertex, basically that means that the first vertex has to be completed before the second vertex. So we can kind of see that these parts can be done in parallel. We can start our sends, we can start our receives, and then the local part can be done in parallel. So just to make this more concrete, this is an example of how that specific SPMV might be realized as a directed acyclic graph. So I've kind of broken it down into three parts here. The part on the right is just that local SPMV. So this is the part of the SPMV that corresponds to the X vector entries that are owned by this rank. And you can see that this can happen immediately from the start of the SPMV. There's this middle part here, which is basically the remote part of the SPMV. So in order for that to happen, we have to first receive our data, wait for those receives to complete, and then we can use, for example, CU sparse to do the actual SPMV on the GPU. And then this has some interaction with the third part, which is where we have to send our local X entries to other ranks. So, for example, we may have written some custom CUDA code to pack the various X entries into a send buffer, and then we send them. And then we're going to draw some extra dependence arrows here so that we post all our sends and receives before we wait for our sends and receives. This is just to prevent basically a live lock in the distributed MPI program. So not only does the directed acyclic graph any topological ordering, any topological traversal of this graph is a valid, correct implementation of this program. So this is sort of the first thing that generates the large design space, right? As long as we obey these dependence edges in this graph, there's many possible orders in which you can traverse the primitive operations in this graph to produce a correct program. The second piece of this is that in addition to any valid topological ordering of the graph, the different assignments of operations to resources can also impact the possible implementations of this program. And so, for example, basically what that means is we can consider the context of just a single GPU, a single CPU, and multiple streams. And so we have two different sort of operations here. So just for example, I'm showing two different options here. One is that where all of the GPU operations happen in a single stream, and if we do that, basically that reduces the amount of overlap we can do between GPU and CPU operations. However, there's also reduced complexity in or reduced cost in the CPU managing more concurrent operations. Whereas if we allow various independent GPU operations to overlap, there's some additional CPU cost for coordinating those operations, but we may be able to overlap some of those operations better. The different traversals of the graph and the different resource assignments generate a large number of possible implementations. And in the case of this SPMV, in the particular circumstances I showed, where we're considering sort of one GPU in that particular graph, the number of possible implementations is actually small enough to just enumerate all of them. And so that's what I've done on this slide here. So what we can see is that there's 2,036 possible implementations, and I've just measured the performance of every single one on a particular platform. And so what we can see is that, and I've sorted them from fastest to slowest. And so what we can see is that between the fastest and slowest possible implementations, there's about a 1.5 x difference. But the other important thing to look at is that most of the different design decisions just don't matter at all. And the way that you can see that on this graph is that, for example, if I look at implementation 1534 and 1607, their performance is essentially the same, even though they represent two different either resource assignments or order of operations. And so what you can see is that, depending on exactly how strict you want to be, there's maybe 3 or 5 sort of design decisions that really matter. So basically, that push you from this high plateau down to the middle plateau or down to this fastest possible range of implementations. And so like I mentioned, for this SPMV, it's possible for us to just brute force all of these different implementations and check them all. But for a general operation of interest, this search space is going to be prohibitively large. What we want to do is focus our effort on these regions where a particular design decision has an enormous impact on the performance, and not spend a lot of time in these regions where when we make some small adjustment to the implementation, there's not an effect on the performance. And so Monte-Carlo tree search is a technique that sort of allows us to jointly explore the design space while sort of emphasizing these regions of interest. So the way Monte-Carlo tree search broadly works is that we represent the search space in a tree. So each node is a particular operation paired with a resource assignment. So for example, this could be a CUDA event record that is recording the contents of stream 0 in event 1. And so this node comes either directly from the directed acyclic graph, or it's a synchronization operation that's been inserted to keep an implementation correct under a specific resource assignment. So the path to this node is sort of the beginning of an implementation. So it's an incomplete implementation because many of the operations haven't occurred yet. The children of a particular node are all possible subsequent operations combined with resource assignments. And so basically a child is allowed to execute when all of its predecessors are complete and have also been, the hardware resources that they are on have been synchronized. Not really shown in this graph is that each node will store empirical performance data for any complete implementation that it's a part of. So basically each prefix in the tree has many possible, subtrees. Each of those subtrees may represent a complete implementation that's been measured, and so the performance of that will be stored in the tree above those subtrees. So the way Monte-Carlo tree search sort of focuses on the valuable regions is that it's an iterative process, so we'll choose a path through the tree as it exists currently, and we'll balance valuable versus unexplored subtrees. So there's basically a theoretical basis for this in the literature, but basically we're going to have an objective function that tells us how valuable a node is. And so, that objective function may be the difference between the maximum and minimum performance observed makes a node more valuable, because that means that somewhere in the subtree of that node, there's some slow implementations and some fast implementations, so some interesting design decisions happening there. We'll create a valid child from the selected subtree. We'll create a complete valid implementation randomly from that child. So that sort of represents a sample of the possible implementations in this child. We'll do an empirical benchmark of that complete implementation, and then we'll store that empirical time in the entire path that led to this complete implementation. And that basically means in the next iteration, we've added some additional data about how fast various implementations in all of these subtrees are, so that we can make a more informed exploration decision in the next iteration. And basically what happens is, as the iterations of this Monte Carlo tree search proceed, the tree becomes deeper and larger in these high reward regions of the design space. But regardless of this, as we go, we're going to store all of the complete implementations and performance results as we go, so that we can generate these design rules later. So the way we generate these design rules is, on the left I've plotted the performance results of the subset of the design space explored by the Monte Carlo tree search. So when I showed a graph like this before, right, it had 2,036 implementations, but Monte Carlo tree search in principle, we're only exploring a subset of the implementation. So here, for example, we only have 200 implementations. We're going to divide those up into performance classes using some sort of basic signal processing. So this is just convolution. So we'll convolve this sorted performance with basically a step function and pick out the peaks. Use that to automatically determine the class labels. And then we'll associate each of those implementations not just with a performance class, but with a feature vector. And this feature vector could be called a sequence to vector transformation, but basically what it is each entry in the feature vector is going to be 1 if a particular design rule is followed, and is going to be 0 if a particular design rule was not followed. And those design rules are either ordering rules, which say an operation happened before a different operation, or they're resource assignment rules, which say 2 operations were assigned to the same resource or not. When we do the decision tree training algorithm on this class labels and feature vectors, the decision tree training algorithm basically chooses the most discriminating feature in the feature vector for across all of the classes at each level of the tree. So basically this just corresponds to the set of rules that best discriminate the performance classes as we've observed them. So each path through this tree is in some sense the minimal set of the design rules that define a performance class. And so if you want to know what makes a particular performance class, sort of the fundamental rules that make a particular performance class the way it is, so whether that's the fastest class or the slowest class, all you have to do is read down the decision tree and literally read the rules off the decision tree. So for example, the fastest class for this particular implementation is we want to do the local SPMV and the pack operations in different streams. And the order of operations that we want to do is we want to start the pack operation, then do the local SPMV, then wait for the pack to complete. So you can just read these textual rules off the design tree. Or off the decision tree. So the important aspect of this decision tree is not the ability to predict the performance of an unseen implementation, but it is to accurately describe the implementations and their performance that we currently observe. So what we do is, it's more important for us to have an accurate decision tree. There's no test or training split. It's more important for us to have an accurate decision tree over the training data than it is to sort of have a generalizable tree. So what we basically do is we just iteratively grow the tree until it's 100% accurate. And this sort of gives us the minimum size decision tree that accurately describes our training data. And so, the one question you can ask is, are we able to find relevant design space regions using this approach? Every iteration in the Monte Carlo tree search is very costly because it's an empirical benchmark of the actual performance. And so on the graph on the upper right here, basically we're showing for a given number of Monte Carlo tree search iterations, how accurate are the rules when we compare it to, and when we take sort of the full empirical, or the full brute force search of the design space as 100% accurate. And so you can see that for when we do fewer iterations, we're somewhat less accurate. And as we increase the number of Monte Carlo tree search iterations, we quickly approach the accuracy as if we had used all of the data. And on the bottom here, basically, I'm showing a qualitative look at the rules that are generated. On the left column is the rules that are generated from the full data set, and then as we move across the page, each of these columns shows what happens as we add more and more iterations to the Monte Carlo tree search. And what I'm showing is that there's multiple possible ways to arrive at a particular performance class. So what I'm showing is the rule set that had the largest number of implementation samples that followed that rule. And so one problem that we've already seen is that, for example, if you have relatively few Monte Carlo tree search iterations, the tree hasn't accumulated that much information about the design space yet. So you basically just have an approximately random sample of the design space, and so the distribution of empirical data points in your tree search is approximately equivalent to the distribution that's in the exhaustive search, and so the rules are substantially similar. You can see that only in 100 and 200 we sort of add this extraneous rule that doesn't violate our sort of golden rules, but it sort of arbitrarily constrains the implementation. When you start doing more and more samples, what happens is that the interesting regions of the design space become overemphasized in these sampled implementations. Which is good because, that's what we want. We want to focus our implementation searches there. But what it causes is that sorted curve, the shape of that sorted curve, to be quite different than it is, than it would look as if we had taken all of the sample points. And so that causes the breakdown, this automatic breakdown of rules, to be different. And so clearly we have some work to do in determining in how to assign the class labels and how to handle the fact that the Monte Carlo tree search appears to be doing what we want, which is focusing on the key regions of the design space, but is causing our rule generation to break down a little bit. So the current status is that we have the C++ CUDA+MPI Monte Carlo tree search implemented, and the machine learning post-processing component is also done in Python, and both of those are available in the Sandia Labs GitHub organization. We are currently looking at validating these results against the current tpetra distributed SPMV implementation in Trilinos. And what I'd kind of like to, the direction I'd kind of like to take this is, one thing that you could do with this is, if any of the design rule results are kind of surprising, that may indicate a particular performance bug on a platform. And the second question is, can we adapt this to handle communication and computation being more tightly integrated? So for example, if communication is triggered in a more fine-grained manner from a CUDA kernel, then our directed acyclic graph of operations sort of has fewer nodes in it, and our design, it becomes a less good representation of the design space. So in summary, we've got CUDA+MPI operations as a DAG. We can generate human interpretable rules for library design while maintaining human provenance over the ultimate implementation. Thank you for your time.